Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going back to summer 2012, taking a look at the national season, and finally taking our deep dive look at Chaos Dragons. Chaos Dragons is the final top tier deck of the format. We've already looked at what I think are really the big four, at least three of the big four: Inzektors, Wind-Up Hunter Loop, and Dino Rabbit. We've also looked at some of the other sort of tier 1.5 decks like Dark World and Hero Beat. We also intend on in the future to profile the rogue decks like Final Countdown. I actually have that on my list. But today we're finally going to profile the final of that four top tier, undisputable tier 1 decks, and that is none other than Chaos Dragons. Chaos Dragons is a deck that got to utilize the new released Dark Flare Dragon and Light Pulsar Dragon in combination with cards that had already existed, like Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon, and of course the Chaos monsters themselves, to put together a deck that could easily play 10 plus boss monsters and a really difficult engine to grind through, right? You're talking about a deck that has the Tour Guide package. It has Lila and Raiko picking off back rows and fueling the graveyard. It has Eclipse Wyvern, an incredibly powerful card that was released alongside Light Pulsar and Dark Flare. And it also has, undisputable, I think, in my opinion, the single best card of that format when activated, Future Fusion. Future Fusion being able to ditch 5 dragons instantly before its errata, triggering Eclipse Wyvern, multiple Eclipse Wyvern, fueling the graveyard with Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon so that it can be recurred with Light Pulsar, maybe even putting Light Pulsar in the grave so you can recur it from the graveyard. Absolutely one of the most backbreaking cards. It put in lights and darks. It could even manipulate to 3 darks with Dark Arm Dragon in your hand. Really, arguably, I don't even think it's much of an argument, but the most powerful card in that summer format. So to me, it gives this deck a lot of advantages. It also was one of the few decks at the time that just didn't play any trap cards, meaning cards like MST, Forbidden Lance, Heavy Storm, cards that were very popular in the format, were often going to be dead draws in game 1, making it a really difficult game 1 matchup. It, in theory, in a lot of people's eyes, was Dino Rabbit's worst matchup because Dino Rabbit historically had difficulty dealing with big monsters. This deck obviously can just put a ton of big monsters on the field with ease, making it such that a Light Pulsar Dragon, if you don't have that Soul Taker and your opponent's not attacking into Deep Prison, can actually be really difficult to deal with. Same would be the case with Chaos Sorcerer and all the other boss monsters. It is, in many ways, one of the reasons why I elected to play Macro Rabbit instead of just traditional Dino Rabbit there in that format, because Macro counteracted, assuming you drew it early enough, that Chaos package really well. But nevertheless, we're going to take our deep dive look at Chaos Dragon, a deck that I think is a really interesting deck, a deck that can utilize the Lightsworn package. So you have Charge, Recharge, really powerful cards with Raiko and Lila to pick off back rows. Very easily fits in the Tour Guide package, so it has access there. Has a reasonable amount of hand traps, I guess a small amount in modern perspective, but you get to play Effect Veiler and Gores, which are light and darks. It also has, I think, a really great extra deck, which is going to sound like an interesting thing to consider, but this deck got to play extra deck monsters that not a lot of other decks got to play. I'm talking about potentially Queen Dragon Djinn. I'm talking about Photon Strike Bouncer, which you would otherwise need to play things like Ladybug in Inzektors, or even sometimes Hopper in combination with that, or these kind of unusual game states where you have a Inzektor that's boosted by 3 levels and then a level 6 like Gigamantis. It can happen, definitely would have happened, but it is a little bit more awkward than potentially the ease that this deck could with triple Chaos Sorcerer and triple Light Pulsar. So a lot of cards that I think make this deck a unique choice in terms of the extra deck, and I think gave it a leg up against some of the competition. I also think it had a really great side deck, right? Any deck that just doesn't play trap cards can really harness that by going into certain trap cards in games 2 and 3. It's a strategy that you even see in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! When a deck like, let's say, Drytron sides in Mystic Mine, a deck that you wouldn't traditionally want to have and out for a back row, all of a sudden siding in a card that can basically be game-breaking. That's one of the things that I'm going to be doing today, where I have both Royal Decree and Shadow Imprisoning Mirror in the side deck, cards that shut down things like Dino Rabbit with Macro Cosmos. They shut down things like Dark World and Inzektors, and all of a sudden not only shut them down temporarily, but theoretically might shut them down for a whole game because you're not going to keep in MST against a deck that has 0 trap cards in game 1. So it's really one of those decks that can harness its advantage against decks like Dino Rabbit, which were very popular with boss monsters. I think a really cool toolbox of extra deck monsters, and then some really good side deck choices. But nevertheless, let's take our first deep dive look at Chaos Dragons. All right, first we'll start with triple Light Pulsar Dragon. So Light Pulsar Dragon, very similar to Chaos Sorcerer, can be summoned from the hand by banishing a Light and the Dark from the graveyard. You technically can summon it from the graveyard by sending a Light and Dark from your hand. That doesn't come off quite as often. I mean, it definitely does, and it's great to have that option, particularly if you have cards in your hand, maybe a dead Tour Guide, for example, or an Effect Veiler that your opponent seems not to play into. So definitely having that option is fantastic, particularly if you have Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon in the graveyard. So one of the frustrating parts about this deck is that when this is on the field, it floats into a level 5 or higher Dark Dragon from your graveyard when it is destroyed. That can be by battle. That can be by card effect. It just says when it is sent to the graveyard from the field. There are actually some interesting plays that I'll talk about with extra deck cards that can actually trigger Light Pulsar Dragon, similar to the ABC monsters. This card, in combination with Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon, can create this little loop where you special summon Red Eyes, you bring this back, and your opponent kills the Red Eyes and then kills this. This brings back the Red Eyes, and then the Red Eyes can bring this back. So you actually have to kill this, hope the opponent doesn't have anything in the graveyard, and then kill the Red Eyes Darkness Metal. If you can't kill both of them in one play, then you're really in a bad position because your opponent can actually even just crash this to special summon back the Red Eyes and then summon this back main phase too. So having access to Light Pulsar plus Red Eyes can be a little bit of a loop that's difficult to deal with depending on what deck you're playing. And you have to sequence your destruction effects in your battle such that you kill this and then Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon. Then we have 2 copies of Dark Flare. I mean, some decks actually played the full 3 copies, but I think 2 copies is just fine. I think the amount of quote-unquote boss monsters in this deck is plenty, right? We're looking at 10+ monsters that have relatively similar effects when you're actually trying to go for game. So having just 2 copies I think is totally fine. It does have an additional effect where you can send a dragon monster from your hand to basically foolish a dragon monster from your deck and then banish a card in either graveyard. There are some cool synergies there where you ultimately end up banishing your own Eclipse Wyvern to trigger its effect, or you can hit something like Hornet out of your opponent's graveyard, so there is some utility there. Then we have 3 copies of Chaos Sorcerer, so that brings us now to, what's this, 8 different cards that special summon off of Light and the Dark, and I guess I should just include Black Luster Soldier while I'm talking about it. So this is one of the reasons why I think having just 2 copies of Dark Flare Dragon is fine. We have literally 9 cards that all summon the same way. This deck, obviously filled with Light and Dark monsters, not a big issue, but you do need to keep it into consideration, and I think you can function without ever drawing Dark Flare, because honestly, this deck tends to draw, obviously you're playing 9 of them, a lot of these boss monsters, and then you even have Dark Arm Dragon. Dark Arm Dragon, in addition to being a dragon, in addition to functioning really well with a deck with a lot of dark monsters, can actually be tutored out with Eclipse Wyvern's effect. It's honestly one of the more ideal targets with Eclipse Wyvern, so we definitely want to include this copy as well. Basically every deck included it. Every once in a blue moon, you might see a version of this deck that played Judgment Dragon. I didn't personally like those versions. Oftentimes, you'd have to play a lot of inferior Lightsworns, and we'll actually talk about the Lightsworn package relatively soon. So, to me, I think this is the good, I'm going to call it boss monster lineup. You could probably include Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon as a boss monster as well. At this point in time, it was not once per turn, so it had yet to face that errata. It's about, honestly, almost 10 years until it was eventually errated to once per turn. That is definitely not the case with Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon. Both parts of the effect can be used as many times as possible, which can be pretty cool, right? You can summon Red Eyes, summon back Light Pulsar Dragon. Maybe you can make a play with the Red Eyes, or it gets destroyed by something, and you crash the Light Pulsar to bring this back, and then summon back Light Pulsar Dragon. There's obviously some great synergy there. The fact that it is I don't know if it's level 11 maybe off the top of my head, I'm not sure. All I know is it's more than level 7. It obviously is going to function with 2 copies of Eclipse Wyvern. So when Eclipse Wyvern is sent to the graveyard, you can banish a level 7 or higher Light or Dark Dragon from your deck, and then when this card is banished from the graveyard, you can add that card to your hand. The targets in this deck are Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon and then Dark Arm Dragon. Technically, it could be Judgment Dragon if you were playing that version, but I wasn't a big fan of it. I think this package is totally fine. I don't think we need to have additional Dead Raws like Judgment Dragon. This deck can sometimes brick a little if you only draw the big monster, so having Judgment Dragon in the deck, I think, only increases that. You could play 3 Eclipse Wyvern. There were versions that did. I think 2 is probably just fine. You technically can tutor it out if you really need with Dark Flare Dragon's effect, and you have so much milling. I think 2 is reasonable. Plus, of course, you have Future Fusion that can tutor it out, so just 2 copies I think is fine. Then we're going to include, I'm going to just call them the starters. We have 3 copies of Tour Guide with, of course, the obligatory Sangan. It is a dark monster, which is fantastic. Technically, there are light rank 3s that we can go into, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So this, in addition to just being a dark monster, can actually facilitate light plus dark. 2 different ways, honestly. You can attack the Sangan into something, or have the Sangan die by battle and search Effect Veiler, and then you have light and dark, or you can go into Giga Brilliant, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and that also facilitates light plus dark. So there are multiple ways of getting into light plus dark with just Tour Guide. Then, of course, we have the Lightsworns. I think it's better just to play the good Lightsworns. There are versions of this deck that played cards like Jane, and I don't think Jane is all that good. You could say, well, what if you want to tutor with charge? Well, there's only 1 charge. You're not really tutoring all that much. So I think only playing the quote-unquote good Lightsworns makes sense, which to me is 3 copies of Lila and 3 copies of Raikou. This deck, I think, can eat through back rows through its monsters, but being able to pick off cards like Macro Cosmos, which is obviously relatively popular in the Macro Rabbit deck at the time, is really valuable. So having Raikou and Lila to do that being able to normal summon Lila and bait something out and then go into a Chaos Monster is just really fantastic. So I think that synergy is great. Obviously, Raikou can be a bit of a liability against a few decks here or there. Like, for example, it's not great against Inzectors, but I think all in all, being able to pick off back rows in a format where there are honestly a lot of back rows is just fantastic. So to me, just playing the quote-unquote good Lightsworns I think makes sense. Basically, the Lightsworns that, for all intents and purposes, can just one-for-one with your opponent's stuff plus mill. Right? You play Jane, it's not really guaranteed that it does anything. You play some of the other Lightsworns like Lumina, it's a little fringy. These ones I think are just the best. Then there are 2 copies of Card Trooper, just a reasonable inclusion. It can crash into Thunder King. It is a bit of a liability against Drak Waiba, but it's a reasonable inclusion. It is an Earth monster, which is a little frustrating, but most of these decks play Card Trooper, so I'm going to include it. Then we have the quote-unquote hand traps. Here I have 3 copies of Effect Veiler. This deck's going to elect to run Effect Veiler over other hand traps, obviously just because it is a light monster, right? We are trying to utilize the fact that it is a light monster in a deck that has so many chaos monsters. And then Gores is a good protection card, right? In the mirror match, it's fantastic. There are some liabilities. It's not good against Inzectors, but it is good against some of the other decks. It's pretty good against Heroes. It's pretty good against Dino Rabbit. It can be a little bit of a liability against windups as well, because it kind of gets stuck in your hand when they're looping you, with Windup Hunter specifically. But besides that, I think it is a reasonable inclusion. It also gives your opponent something to think about in the mirror match. Because this deck's not playing something like Solemn Warning, you do have to consider that when you make an OTK push that your opponent could have Gores. But that is the monster lineup. Obviously, it's a very large monster lineup. That's one of the aspects of this deck, is that you have a giant monster count to facilitate all those chaos monsters. The spell lineup is going to include 3 copies of Solar Recharge to go with our 6 Lightsworns, and 1 copy of Charge of the Light Brigade. As has been the case in any time that these cards have been in just about any deck, you obviously want to see these as much as possible with targets, obviously, goes without saying. But once you get these going and you start to mill cards and can get incremental card advantage by milling Eclipse Wyverns or just fueling your graveyard with Light and Darks, it's obviously fantastic. In addition to facilitate some of that sort of turbo aspect of the deck, there's 1 copy of Allure of Darkness. It combines relatively well with some of the other cards in this deck. I will say, this deck doesn't have the great dark targets that make it an obvious combo with Leviair, right? In this deck, in terms of actual Leviair targets, you basically just have Sangan plus Torguide, so it's not like you're banishing a Inzectus Centipede and then combo with Inzectors and summoning back with Leviair. So it does have a little bit of an issue there, but you have so many quote-unquote boss monsters and so many of them are dark. Having the ability to just banish one when, for example, you don't really want one in your hand because you're lacking the lights and darks in the grave, I think is really good. In addition to other combo facilitators, we have, quite frankly, just the best card in the deck, which is Future Fusion. With this deck, you are sending for 5-headed dragon. So in this case, you're going to be sending 5 monsters to the graveyard, which means you can send multiple copies of Eclipse Wyvern, which is absolutely incredible. You can send copies of Light Pulsar Dragon. You can send Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon. You can even summon Light Pulsar from the graveyard if you want. Putting Red Eyes in the graveyard makes it so that your Light Pulsar suddenly have the most ideal target. You have basically any chaos monster, and now all of a sudden you're banishing the Eclipse Wyverns that you sent there, and you're almost assuredly going to win at that point. So it's really a fantastic card. It's one of those cards that it was a huge groan test, right? Your opponent played Future Fusion, and you basically felt you lost the game. This is really one of the last decks where that was the case. Future Fusion, just absolutely ridiculous card in this deck. And then we have, I'm going to call it sort of the Trinity at the time. In retrospect, and maybe cards like Dark Hole weren't as good as they seemed to be, but they were sort of those limited power spells. We had Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, and Heavy Storm you absolutely need to include. Same thing with Monster Reborn. And this deck's going to include 1 copy of MST in the main deck. You could actually play more than 1 copy, but this deck's already looking at 40, so we're not going to go too high above that. As the format progressed, the mirror match got a little bit more popular. You're already playing Raikou and Lilas. You do actually have ways to clear back rows and don't necessarily need multiple MSTs. Now, when I do say that, that also means on one other side, you're a little bit more vulnerable to macrocosmos-based strategies, but you have a side deck for a reason. Next is the extra deck. The extra deck's actually really interesting. There are way more than 15 cards that I'd want to include. So this pile is actually more than that. I'm going to give you what I think is a representative list of cards that one could include and talk about the ones that I think are necessary and talk about ones that are a little bit more fringe and a little bit more optional, but are still really good choices. 5-headed dragon, there's no debate. You absolutely needed it. There's no debate there. Synchros for this deck are pretty limited. You have Effect Veiler and then you have Monster Reborn, so there's not an exhaustive list of monsters that you can go into. We have a copy of Scrap Dragon. Gores is the most logical level 7 in our deck. We have Black Rose Dragon. The most logical level 6 to combine with Effect Veiler is Light Pulsar Dragon and Chaos Sorcerer. I guess we also have Dark Arm to go into Scrap Dragon, though that seems like a trade down, to be honest. We have Bryanak. Dark Flare Dragon is level 5, so being able to do Dark Flare Dragon plus Defect Veiler is useful. That, you know, can sometimes come up. Having a card like Bryanak can be useful there. We have Catastor. We have a bunch of level, not a bunch, but we have some level 4s with Lila. We have a good amount of level 3s. I think Army Arm is one of the ones you should probably include just because your deck has Black Luster Soldier in it, right? Being able to play into Black Luster Soldier with Armory Arm for the OTK, I think, is really great. You can equip this to a Black Luster Soldier, and because Black Luster Soldier can attack twice, it's going to deal damage equal to the monster's attack that is destroyed. If your opponent has monsters in attack position, you actually just kill them outright, because the damage difference between Black Luster Soldier and their monster plus the damage dealt by Armory Arm is actually just 8,000, so it's a really fantastic combo. I think you reasonably can go get by with this as a synchro package. It's basically one of the best synchros from each of the levels, and you could debate, you know, maybe it's fringy that you need to have, you know, something to go with the 2 Dark Flare. So I could understand manipulating this, but here I think is probably the smallest list that you could probably pick from. Then for Exceeds, this deck has a bunch of them. So let's start with the rank 3s because we have the Tour Guide package. You need Leviair, that is non-negotiable. I think Zen Mains is non-negotiable. It's too good, too defensive. I think Acid Golem is non-negotiable. This deck can, you know, OTK quite frequently, and that's the largest damage output. I think Giga Brilliant is non-negotiable because it is a light monster. It makes it so that Tour Guide can actually go into an Exceed monster and put a light monster, at least on the field, eventually hitting the graveyard for your Chaos monsters and not having to rely on Sang and Dying. I think Leviathan Dragon is more or less non-negotiable. One of the reasons why Leviathan Dragon is actually pretty good is it makes it such that Tour Guide can turn into a dragon, right? Leviathan Dragon is a dragon, which Leviair is not. Leviair, although has the word dragon in its name, is actually an aqua. That means it's a target for Red Ice Darkness Metal Dragon, so that is actually a synergy there that is definitely worth considering. Tempo's a little bit more of the toolbox type of effect. I really love Tempo in this format, but you could definitely consider cutting it if you don't think it's that valuable. For the rank 4s, not a lot of people, I don't want to say not a lot, but some people cut Dragoon, or Djinn Dragon. I think this card is insane, though. Queen Dragon Djinn. This card is absolutely nuts. It's 2 level 4s, which obviously doesn't happen all that much, but you can special summon one of the big dragons from your graveyard, and it can't attack and its effects negated, but it just puts a big body on the field, and then dragon monsters cannot be destroyed by battle except this one, which can actually come up every now and then. So I think this card is actually pretty good. Now, granted, because you're not playing a ton of level 4s, I can understand that, you know, you look at the deck and you say, well, there's only really Lila. That's not a ton of ways to actually get into it. I can understand that criticism. There is Monster Reborn, though, and I definitely think that's something to consider. And the fact that you're also getting that dragon monsters you control cannot be destroyed by battle part is actually pretty valuable. It's actually pretty valuable. It's something that your opponent can often overlook with a card like this. Not that it's just obviously printed on the card, but I definitely think it's something your opponent can overlook, right? They have to target this with their attacks first, and I think that's a pretty reasonable effect. So to me, it's a pretty good card. I understand that rank 4s aren't all that common in this deck, but I think it's such a powerful one. In addition to rank 4s, and again, this is going to fall into that same trap where you look at it and say, is Utopia really worth it, right? You're not going to a lot of rank 4s, but you could consider the Utopia Ray package. You could then jump up to, let's go to rank 5s. We have Adrius and Tyrus to go with our copies of Dark Flare Dragon. Again, you could argue you're really going into rank 5s. You have 2 Dark Flares. Maybe you just want one. I think Tyrus is better than Adrius, but Adrius plays around Macrocosmos, or at least can destroy Macrocosmos without having to rely on the battle going through, which can sometimes falter if you consider cards like Deep Prison. So maybe just one of them. I can understand cutting it. For the rank 6, this is another rank 5 actually. This one's not as common, Wind Up Zenmayo, but in a back row heavy format against decks like Hero and Dino Rabbit, you could consider it. Maybe one of these is better, but I just want to point out that it was legal. It is one to consider. Excabeetle is actually one of the cool cards in this deck. It is definitely a card that you want to include. Basically what this card does is when it's XYZ summoned, you target one monster in either player's graveyard and you equip it to this, right? Kind of like an Insector effect. And then this card gains attack and defense equal to half the original attack of that monster, so it boosts higher than 1,000. That's not really the important part. What this card does, though, is once per turn, you can detach a material and then destroy one face-up card on either player's field. Why that's so cool is that actually triggers Light Pulsar Dragon's effect. Light Pulsar Dragon doesn't need to be destroyed as a monster. It just needs to be sent from the field to the graveyard. So some of the cool plays that this deck could do is this, could use, let's say, a Chaos Sorcerer, banish, use its effect, summon, let's say, you know, whether it's another Chaos Sorcerer, whether it's just summoning Light Pulsar Dragon itself. Hopefully you have one in the graveyard, and then you use this effect and you equip Light Pulsar from your graveyard, and then you detach, destroy their monster, destroy your Light Pulsar Dragon, trigger Light Pulsar, bring back Red Eyes, bring back Light Pulsar, and then you can just kind of combo off from there. So this is one of the cooler cards in the deck, and I think it has a really cool utility there. We have Photon Strike Bouncer, which gives this deck a little bit of a differing game plan. What I mean by that is, you know, at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, besides cards like actual Lagi and Doka, you didn't often just pass to your opponent with negates up, right? That's more of a modern Yu-Gi-Oh thing where you pass to your opponent with 6 or 7 negates and see if they can play through it. Back in older Yu-Gi-Oh, you kind of pass to your opponent with cards like Zen Mains, or maybe even a card like Scrap Dragon, putting them in kind of that Scrap Dragon lock, if you're familiar with what I'm referring to. A card like Strike Bouncer actually is a negate. It requires 2 level 6s, which this deck does have, the Chaos Sorcerers and the Light Pulsar, so it does go into it every now and then, and it gives it a little bit of a different game plan. And then a Gaia Charger. I think Gaia Charger is valuable, right? You're going to be playing a good chunk of these higher rank monsters, so having the ability to, you know, use Excavabeetle and then destroy, get that Light Pulse, and then overlay for Gaia Charger can really put out a lot of damage. So this is way more than 15. You know, there are definitely, let's say, these ones are all mandatory. I think Armoriam is mandatory. I think Five-Headed Dragon is mandatory. I think at least one of these is mandatory. I think these are all mandatory. And then you can kind of fill in up to 15 from that point. So I decided to include way more than 15. You kind of make the decision. You can look back at some old deck lists and see this was, for the most part, the type of cards that you would see in the extra deck, for better or for worse. In terms of the side deck and top decks at the time, so it's been a little while since we profiled this format, so just to run through it real quick, we have Hero Beat, we have Dark World, we have, of course, Insectors, Dino Rabbit, we have Wind-Ups, and then we have the Mirror Match. To me, these are really the top decks. Heretics had just come out, so you could consider that. Final Countdown was a deck on the absolute fringes that did top YCS Philadelphia. There were a few other fringe decks here or there, but to me, these are really the top decks. These are the top decks. These are kind of the big 4, and these are the ones on the outside looking in that could actually still do relatively well. So how are we combating this? I'm pretty afraid of wind-ups. I feel like going back to this format, wind-ups were probably better than they were represented. As time went on, the deck became more and more popular. It was really popular at the beginning, then it fell out of popularity, and then it kind of resurged in the middle of the format after National. So I'm going to play 3 Maxis, although it's not a light or dark monster. It really is the best hand trap against the wind-up combo. So we're going to play 3 Maxis. We're going to play Victoria. Victoria's kind of a cool card if you're not familiar, right? This card is not really seen a ton of play in Yu-Gi-Oh, but it's a pretty cool card, right? So it's a light monster, which is a benefit. It's a fairy, which isn't great. But basically, once per turn, you can target a dragon monster in your opponent's graveyard, and you special summon it to your side of the field. And then your opponent cannot target face-up fairy monsters for attacks except this one. That second effect basically never comes up. But the fact that you can just recur your opponent's Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon is just absolutely insane. It's an 1800, which is, you know, nothing to laugh at. It is a light monster, so it has some things going for it. We have a Tragodia, just to give our opponent something to think about, keep them honest in the mirror match. That's really what it's there for. Some of these decks included in the main, but I think it's just so bad against Wind-Up Hunter and so bad against Insectors, we don't. Just so you're aware why I always say that cards like Gores and Tragodia are bad against Insectors. Although Insectors can combo, and maybe in the back of your mind you're thinking, well, I could at least stop an OTK. Yes, but if your opponent gets to main phase 2, they're just going to destroy it with Hornet and probably make a field that's almost impossible to break through anyway. So playing Tragodia like Battle Fader, I think, is only a marginal decision, right? I think you should try and combat it with other cards. So Tragodia is there for some of the other decks, like the Mirror Match. 2 MSTs so that we have some outs to Macrocosmos. And Level Limit Area B, that was a card that, to be honest, I popularized in Dino Rabbit. It's a card that I really advocated in the Dino Rabbit side deck against this particular deck, because you could shift Lila to defense mode and make it so that there are only outs to Macro and Level Limit, where basically the side deck cards like MST, the One Heavy Storm, and then Raikou, and I think with Lagi and Doku, you could deal with that pretty effectively. So you really want to max out on MST for that matchup. Soul Taker is an interesting one. You could put it in the mirror match. Soul Taker actually makes Light Pulsar miss timing. Light Pulsar is optional, and the life point gain that Soul Taker grants actually makes it such that you can miss timing. You can also make the Shining miss timing. And then we have 3 copies of Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, which might seem weird in a deck that has a lot of dark monsters, but this is basically game over against Insectors. And because your deck doesn't play any traps, it's unlikely they're going to have cards like MST in their deck. They might hedge. MST is actually pretty good as a combo piece in Insectors, because you can just destroy your own Gigamantis and other cards equipped to Dragonfly and Centipede as needed, or even the Sword. But for the most part, I think you should side it out against this particular deck because otherwise it's dead against what the opponent's doing. So having Shattering Present Mirror can really stop your opponent and kind of surprise them with a card that they might not have an out to. Same thing against Dark Worlds. And I think your deck can function totally fine without Dark effects if your opponent's not using any Inzektor as a Dark World. And then 2 Royal Decrees, we're playing double Royal Decree because it's a great card against Macro Rabbit. It's a good card against some of the other trap-heavy decks too, to an extent like Heroes. Right? If they don't have Gemini Spark, it's really good. I would definitely side it against them. And any other deck where they're going to be playing a lot of trap cards, maybe you'll run into, to an extent, some versions of windups. It kind of depends on the player, but I think Royal Decrees is a great card in a deck that literally plays no traps. So without getting into anything else, I think this is a pretty reasonable and actually very representative side deck. All right, I didn't really go off the grid and add cards that really weren't popular. This was very representative. I actually think, for the most part, this deck is incredibly representative of the format. I don't know if I would actually change a lot. I think this deck is actually really quite refined. But nevertheless, that's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.